Today we're going to be talking about image file extensions. So what are the differences between the main ones and which ones should you choose and when? So the four main ones we're going to be talking about are JPEG, PNG, TIFF, and the different types of raw image files. And I'll talk about those when we get there. We've probably heard of JPEG and PNG before. They're two of the most popular image files that we use. So JPEG, in short, I'll get into JPEG a little bit more in the next slide, but in short, they're really good for photographs, for realistic looking images. PNG, on the other hand, is really good for graphics and vector images and things like that. One, because you can get transparent images out of them, right? As you can see in this logo here, it's got a transparent background. If this was saved as a JPEG, it would have a white background to it. So, one, it's good for that, but it's also what we call a lossless image format, which means PNG it saves a lot more data within its file, which is really good to get those really crisp, clear graphics. Whereas, as we're going to learn, JPEGs are what we call a lossy format, which means that it's compressed. It's not as big of a file. It doesn't have as much data inside of it. TIFF, on the other hand, is kind of like the best of both worlds of JPEG and PNG. TIFF is lossless as well, which means, again, it does not compress. It has a lot of data in there, and it's good for both graphics and realistic looking images. The real reason you would use something like TIFF format is if you're going to be printing your photographs on a big scale. So more than just, your normal 4x6 or 5x7, or even more than an 8.5 by 11, like a normal piece of paper. If you're going from that normal piece of paper or anything bigger, a TIFF is really good because it's scalable. Which means you can take your picture, your photograph, and scale it big. If you're doing like a big wall poster or something like that, it'll keep the quality. And then lastly, we come to what we call raw images. And these are images that DSLR cameras can take. Most DSLR cameras will take both JPEG and RAW. If you go into the camera settings, you can choose to take either one or the other, or I guess most cameras will be able to take both at the same time. So if you snap one picture with your camera and then go into the memory, it'll show that picture both in a JPEG and in a RAW format. What the RAW format is, it's essentially, it's almost like a draft picture. It is a very big file size because it contains a lot of data, because those raw images are meant for photo editing. That's why there's going to be so much data in there. It's going to be a huge image file because we're expecting to work with those. And I'll get into that on the next slide as well. But there's a few different extensions for raw images. Raw images are kind of like a category of file extensions, and each camera will shoot in their own file extension. So for example, Nikons will shoot in NEF raw images. That's just their file extension, Nikon something format. CR2 is Canon's, which is now being replaced by CR3. I don't know how recent that was, so maybe it's all CR3 by now, but could be CR2 still in some models. And then Sony's is ARW, Alpha Raw something. I'm not really too sure. But those are your raw extensions. So when we talk about photography, again, we're really going to be focusing on JPEG and RAW. Again, we can use TIFF, but that's really more for publishing, when you're actually going to take your pictures and print them on something big. So for us, let's just focus on JPEG and RAW and just really see what the differences are. So again, for JPEG, we call it a lossy file, which means lossy as in loss of quality. You're going to lose some quality when you go to a JPEG format because it's a smaller file size. However, that makes it a lot easier to share. It's easier to put it on web pages, it's easier to put it on your phone, it's easier to put it anywhere. So that's the main reason why it's so popular. If we were to put huge file extensions on all of our websites and social media and everything, it would make things go so much slower. It would drive up our internet usage, our data usage. So JPEGs are usually the way to go, especially in our digital world. However, because of that loss of quality, that loss of data, there's not as much data for photo editing. You can definitely do quite a bit of work with JPEGs in something like Lightroom or Photoshop, but you don't have as much raw data to work with there, which is where we come to raw images. That's where it comes from, raw image files. These are lossless. They keep a whole bunch of data in that one file, which means it's a large file size. Because of that, it's great for photo editing, and we start to see this word called recoverable data, which means, let's just say you take a picture and it's really dark. The picture itself is really dark, it's underexposed. There's a lot of places in the picture where it almost looks just completely black. If it's a raw image file, there's still a lot of data in those dark areas that you can, for example, up the exposure in a program like Lightroom, and then you can start to see whatever was there come back to life. You can see that detail again. Whereas if you had that in a JPEG, those dark areas are pretty much always going to be dark. So you get some more recoverable data in a raw file. But that being said, again, raw files are meant to be drafts, essentially. We're going to be working with this file some more before it's done. So therefore, it's not really widely compatible with a lot of apps or programs or web pages. Like even I tried with PowerPoint here to try and import a NEF file into PowerPoint, the Nikon raw image, and it just wouldn't let me. It's not compatible. So for that reason, really the only reason why we want raw images is so we can photo edit them. Other than that, once we're done editing our raw image, we're most likely going to be exporting it, converting it into a JPEG, just so it's easily more shareable. And you're not really going to see a difference between when you save it as a raw file and save it as a JPEG. Especially on our screens, you're not really going to see much of a difference unless you're zooming in a lot. Then you can start to see that the JPEGs are going to have a little bit less quality than the raw images. But again, for pretty much everyday use, you're not going to see a big quality difference between JPEG and RAW in the finished product.